As we begin our study of the novel Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, there are a few things that I think are very helpful to us to have in terms of background knowledge for the characters, the setting, the way that the novel is structured, etc. So let's start by looking at some of the themes that we're going to explore in the novel. Obviously, this is our primary source, our primary work for our unit on gender, and that becomes a major theme in the novel as well. So how do these relations between men and women work? The treatment of children and of women we will see throughout, from Jane and her treatment as a child to Jane as a governess, then caring for a child and being responsible for them. So what were the attitudes towards them? The idea of religious faith, and then religious hypocrisy. So how could religion be used to kind of further one's own place in the world? And we'll see that a lot in Lowood with Mr. Brocklehurst. The realization of selfhood. We really stay with Jane from the time that she's 10 years old until the end of the novel, where she's a grown woman. And so what has to occur for her to be able to reach that level of maturation? The nature of love. The nature of abusive love, the nature of dependent love, and what definitions of love does Bronte give us in the novel? And then that of atonement and forgiveness. What are we able as humans to forgive? What are we able to not really move past? The novel structure is really unique in that it's a narrative. It's written in the first person. Jane Eyre is our narrator. But it's supposed to be a memoir written by a real woman named Jane Eyre, and then it's edited by Currier Bell. That's Charlotte Bronte's pseudonym. She publishes under a male name. But it's supposed to be this story told in retrospect. So, we're getting this, it's always told in past tense. This was what happened to me as a child. And yet, the novel's suspense relies on the fact that the narrator is not entirely omniscient, or at least that she does not reveal key information until the point in the chronology of events where Jane herself becomes aware, because that has to keep the reader going. Obviously, if she's telling this in retrospect, she knows the answer to the mystery. She knows all of this other information. But if she reveals that, then she does damage to the story and to the audience's engagement in the story. So the novel structure becomes very interesting there. Part 1 is typically defined as Jane's childhood, with chapters 1 and 10. Jane's childhood in Gateshead, and then her schooling at Lowood. And the major characters there become Mrs. Reed, Jane's aunt, and her children, Mr. Brocklehurst, the owner of the school at Lowood, Helen Burns, her friend at Lowood, and then Miss Temple, her teacher at Lowood. There's some major conflicts between Jane and Mrs. Reed, her aunt, and then in Jane's time at Lowood, and how she has this friendship with Helen because they are two girls who are seemingly on the outcasts of Lowood. Part 2, this is Jane at Thornfield Hall. And this is where we're introduced to Mr. Rochester and a whole cast of characters there. The main conflict here is this developing relationship between Jane and Rochester. And this is really where we begin to see the Gothic elements of the novel come into play, specifically this idea of the supernatural. And then part 3, chapters 28 through the end, this is where we have Jane kind of taking this very random detour into Marsh End, and then eventually returning to Thornfield. We will skip the majority of her time at Marsh End because it just doesn't advance the storyline in the way that we're examining it. But we do have the major character of Reverend St. John Rivers, not St. John. We reference him as St. John. The British are odd. And his sisters. This is the conflict in her attempt to find shelter after leaving Thornfield, and then her relationship with St. John. In terms of setting, the action of the book takes place in northern England. We're in the early to mid-19th century, and it covers this span of about 12 years. When we reference the setting, and you just heard me referencing the different parts of the novel, we typically reference them in terms of the individual houses. The narrator describes the settings very vividly. And so we're really creating this illusion of realism in that way. Okay. What I think is important is that each setting or grouping of settings corresponds with a very distinct phase of Jane Eyre's life. So very specific places. We have Gateshead Hall. This is Mrs. Reed's home, where Jane spends her childhood, and this is where the novel opens. Lowood Institution, that's a charity school from impoverished orphans. This is where Jane gains knowledge and friendship. And then we have Thornfield Hall. That's Mr. Rochester's home, and this, of course, is where Jane finds love. And we're skipping Moor House and Marsh End. Within the novel, nature is definitely a key piece of imagery that we want to pay attention to. It's used to suggest the character's moral condition and state of mind. The weather and the sky, at the very opening of the novel, Jane sets the scene by mentioning that the cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so somber and a rain so penetrating. Bronte relies quite a bit on this idea of coincidence as a device for advancing the novel's plot. And this was pretty common during the Victorian period. It was a pretty accepted literary convention. Charles Dickens uses it a great deal in their works. Lots of people consider it a weakness in the novel. Coincidence puts a strain on the reader's credibility, yet it's just necessary to drive important developments in the plot. And so we'll see Bronte using this a great deal, especially in terms of knowledge that Jane didn't have. And then she suddenly will find out, oh, I am related to that person, through the idea of coincidence. More symbolism and imagery, the idea of the trees, looking definitely at the cyclical nature of the seasons there. Fire becomes an important symbol. We most closely connect that with Rochester. Water, the idea of rebirth, certainly, and the idea of baptism. The Red Room, which you will read about in Chapter 2, becomes a very important symbol of imprisonment and exile and of Jane's struggle to find freedom. And then we're going to look at Bertha, a character that will come to light in the Thornfield section of the novel, and she really becomes this idea of the confined Victorian wife. There's great significance of names that I want you to just be aware of throughout. So certainly Jane Eyre, okay, looking at the idea of Eyre itself. Helen Burns, the idea of fire there, and Helen Burns does have red hair. Rochester, a very stony place, okay, so very contrasting to Jane. Blanche will become a suitor for Rochester, kind of Jane's competition there. And then, of course, we're going to look at some of the irony there. Now we're going to take a quick look at Gothic literature. Okay, and what it means to look at Gothic literature. So our definition is a form of literature in which events take the reader from the reasoned order of the everyday world into the dark and dreadful world of the supernatural. So there's leaving behind what we know to be true. It's very, very connected to the Romantic movement. You'll remember the Romantic movement from last year in American literature. The Romantics kind of reject this idea that reason can explain everything. You know, they put their faith in the powers of imagination. And it's this real idea of imagination being a creative force, that there are things in this world that logic and reason can't explain, and that our imagination has to help fill in the holes for us. You know, when we think of the word Gothic in our time period, this might be images of what we think of. We very much think of it in physical dress. But what we're talking about really in literature is this idea of imagination and the supernatural. So there are a couple of key characteristics for Gothic literature, and the first is the setting. Okay, so the setting in a Gothic novel is typically a castle, a large mysterious mansion. It has hidden rooms. It has hidden staircases. There's this sense that there are parts of the house or the castle that are abandoned. And the setting really becomes its own character in a Gothic novel. The atmosphere is one of mystery and suspense. There's the idea of a threatening feeling. So we want to really look at the way that the setting is described, that the atmosphere is described. Does it feel ominous to us? The idea of the written word. Typically there's a manuscript of some sort. There are writings, whether it be diaries or journals or things like that. And again, it kind of puts us in this idea of looking at the world through another lens. There are typically warnings, omens, portents, disturbing visions or dreams. And it's this idea that bad things are coming. So, for example, if a statue of the Lord of the Manor fell over, You know, it could portend his death. It could foretell of that. Certainly the appearance of the supernatural, that there are events that occur that, you know, are really indescribable, unexplainable, but they're given a natural explanation. You know, like we have to figure out why these things happened. Very high emotion. So very, you know, dramatic. Characters become overwhelmed by anger and sorrow and terror. They're suffering from raw nerves. Constantly got this feeling of impending doom, and they really let their emotions kind of make decisions for them. And then there's typically a woman or women that's in distress. You know, it's this idea of the damsel in distress. So they're often fainting or terrifying. They're an oppressed heroine often is the central figure. Jane kind of breaks the mold in that she's not often overcome by great emotion, but there are lots of women around her who are. Okay?